Today on BRStv Investigates, it's time to pull back the curtain on the Philips Coral Care LED. One of the most interesting developments that's happened in reef tank lighting in recent years is the announcement that Philips is entering the reefing industry. Philips not only manufactures the LEDs themselves and the thought leaders in all types of lighting technologies, but also producers of everything from toothbrushes to electric razors, TVs, projectors, really thousands of home use and industrial products. So I think the big question here is, what does Philips know about reefing? I think there are two solid camps here. One that strongly feels they'd rather buy a light designed by a company that's entrenched in the reefing space, knows reefers' needs, and then utilizes components from the lighting technology leaders of the world. The other camp is really excited by the potential of the lighting technology leaders of the world applying that skill set and wealth of resources to an application like reefing. Which camp is right is what we're after today. I think this is a big deal because lighting by an exponential magnitude is the single largest source of nutrition for a vast majority of corals and reef tanks, and in turn the single largest limiting factor to growth and cause of undesirable color or growth traits, and even mortality in well-maintained reef tanks. LED lighting has come a long way since we saw the first generations, but there's still a lot of room to grow before they're truly superior on all fronts to older technologies like T5s and halides in terms of intensity, correct spectrum, spectrum blending, proper dispersion and spread, ease of use, and some other pretty desirable elements. Before we get too far into this, the Coral Care hasn't made it into the US yet and only sold in European power versions. It certainly looks like it's coming to the US at some point, but that will largely depend on demand. What ultimately comes here may also look very different as well. The Philips Coral Care claims a wide spectral range, optimized for coral growth and natural reef appearance, perfect light balance, unique homogeneous light distribution and color mixing solution, low energy consumption thanks to highly efficient LEDs, easy to control by intelligently combining various LEDs at different wavelengths. We've simplified the setup of the lighting controller for the user. Low maintenance, long life, robust design and materials, easy to install, driver is integrated into the fixture, hanging kit included, and the computer interface. These are the things that we're going to put to the test. More or less, the single biggest difference with the Coral Care LED is they use a diffuse panel, which is basically a piece of frosted glass over exposed LEDs. If you take the diffuser glass off, you can see it's largely just a grid of LEDs similar to many products on the market or even do-it-yourself projects. So I think a huge portion of what we're really testing today is the impact of a diffusion plate over a large dispersed array of LEDs has on a reef tank application. So let's start with the claim of wide spectral range. I think it's outside the scope of this video to prove definitively which spectrum is the most beneficial, but we can certainly take a look at the claim of wide spectral range, specifically the blue end, which I think everyone universally agrees is the most important. Everyone is going to approach this differently, but in my opinion, we need to have some type of benchmark to measure what a wide spectrum really is, and since science hasn't produced definitive technical knowledge in relation to all corals, certainly not anything that's been universally agreed upon, I think we need to look at a more practical knowledge, such as individuals and reefing communities and where they've seen the most success. I think the ATI Blue Plus T5 bulb is the best example we have in our hobby of a spectrum that's seen the most success in both personal and commercial growth applications. I really don't think that you'll find a single light source that's achieved so much universal success by what I would refer to as a critical mass of users. You can see the blue spectrum peak ranges all the way from 400 to 500 nanometers. The spectrum bands are also in balance with each other in terms of intensity, which is referenced by how thick and uniform the blue band is almost all the way to the peak. So while LEDs have come a long way, they haven't nailed spectrum quite yet. With most of them, there's a rather sharp, narrow peak of a single band. You can see some of the more popular LED options, spectrum blend, when they're turned to 100%, are missing spectrum or at least spectrum intensity balance on the ends near 420 and 490. I will say I think the Radion Gen 4 from Ecotech is a standout in terms of the closest and easily the widest blue spectrum of LEDs that we've reviewed, so at the moment, the spectrum standard of LEDs. So how does a Coral Care perform in terms of spectrum? Well, I would say it certainly performs really well in the deeper blue spectrums near 420, but it's missing a lot of the lighter blue spectrum from 460 to 490, which means it isn't the widest spectrum LED out there, but it does outperform most of the pack, so I'd refer to it as mid-wide. Again, you can debate all day which spectrum is the most important. All we're trying to confirm is the claim of wide spectrum in reference to competitive products and older end-user proven technologies. In this case, I'll give it a 7 out of 10 because it still isn't meeting the standard of older technology, but it does perform better than most of the competition, and it covers a deeper blue spectrum better than many, which seems to be the hot topic these days. The next claim is perfect light balance, which means optimal balance between good color mixing and a homogeneous light distribution. I'm going to start with color mixing. When I showed you the spectrum chart for the ATI fluorescent bulb, this is a single lamp which is emitting all of these spectrums uniformly. With LEDs, we're using a variety of different color LEDs and then attempting to blend them into a single uniform spectrum. And I think this is where it starts to get really interesting. A vast majority of the LED modules and fixtures out there either use exposed LEDs or LEDs in reflectors or lenses with the expectation that they blend together into a single spectrum as they get further away from the light source. In actual use, that works to some degree, but probably not as well as many people would like. There is certainly some room for improvement. Just to give you an idea, we took a 9-point spectrum measurement on a 2-foot grid with a common implementation of a cluster of individual LEDs under individual lenses. At 12 inches over the meter, you can see the spectrum is significantly different depending on where you position the spectrometer, indicating at 12 inches under the light, all of the spectrums haven't blended uniformly. Same test at 18 inches over the meter, the results are much more blended, so the blending with the cluster of individual LEDs absolutely gets better the further you get away from the light source, but one should certainly expect significant spectrum hotspots in the top half of the tank. So how did the Philips Coral Care perform in this regard? Well, all of the outside measurements were almost identical, which is impressive. However, the one measurement in the center had a pretty significant difference in spectrum. To look at why that might be, you have to look at the arrangement of LEDs on the Coral Care. You can see there's a heavy amount of white and blue LEDs on the outside ring with the other colors clustered in the center. This is obviously creating a spectrum hotspot of sorts, but looking at the consistency of the outside measurements, one can assume a pretty uniform fall off, which is much better than a vast majority of the other lights we've tested. So how did it do at 18 inches, which considering mounting height more or less simulates a 12-inch depth in the tank? I have to say, once you get a bit further from the light, Philips' approach of the diffusion panel performed astoundingly well. The spectrum is almost identical at each measurement point in the 2-foot grid. There's only tiny differences, not even really worth noting. This is the best I've seen any light perform in this regard. There's another piece to this that's also rarely considered by the reefing community, but should be, and that's the impact that the water and surface ripples have on the spectrum blending, meaning how well the light is blended as it passes through the water and ripples. This is something you can often see with the naked eye, where rather than seeing a uniform blended spectrum, you're looking at a grid of dancing colors and separated spectrums. To help capture that, we also took spectrum measurements under the tank through the bottom glass panel with a small pump providing some surface agitation. Except in this case, we took 9 measurements from the exact same location to see what the difference was from second to second. Again, for reference point, this is how your standard cluster of non-diffuse LEDs performs under 24 inches of water. Every single measurement is different, meaning rather than providing corals a uniform spectrum like halides and T5s, this is just a random flash of all kinds of spectrums. Also note that this effect is presumably more pronounced the higher you get in the tank and the closer you get to the light source. What we're measuring is the best blending performance at the bottom of the tank. So how does the Philips Coral Care perform in this regard? Well, the 9 measurements we took had virtually no difference between any of them, and the spectrum was very uniform, meaning the diffusion plate is blending the light in a way that's entering the tank uniformly, and the surface ripples have minimal impact on how it's blended or dispersed in the tank. In my mind, this is a pretty desirable performance feature. It's hard to definitively say what impact the blended spectrum versus the flashes of constantly changing spectrums has on corals, but I think most of us agree that the blended spectrum is more desirable and visually more appealing as well. It also seems silly to just make the assumption that rapid flashes of different spectrums are the same as a uniform blended spectrum. That could be the case, but not what corals have evolved to utilize, and for that reason alone, I think the burden of proof is to assume homogeneous blended spectrums are indeed better for the coral's health and growth functions. So in relation to their claim of better color mixing, I think there's still room for improvement at shallow depths close to the light, but in general, the Coral Care LED is what I would call an evolutionary leap above most products on the market. Simply adding the diffusion plate seems to have had a very positive impact. So how about in terms of homogeneous light or par distribution? I can tell you just by looking at it and applying common sense, the coral care is going to distribute the light more evenly simply because the LEDs are spread out much further and illuminating a large diffusion pane rather than a compact cluster of LEDs. The larger distribution is going to reduce irregular growth patterns, par hotspots, shadowing effects, and coral mortality associated with these things. That said, let's take a quick look at some par data in a 30-inch cube measuring 36 points. I'll be quick because this is easily the best light source I've tested in this regard. At a depth of 6 inches, there's a 36-point average of 220 par, which is just about the highest I've measured of any lighter technology we've tested. Not only that, but rather than the typical hotspot most LED modules produce in the 600 to 800 range that falls off 300 to 400 points just 6 inches to the right, the spread in light fall off is much more uniform and reasonable. Testing at a depth of 12 inches, this is the exact blanket of light everyone in the industry has been waiting for. Seriously, I've never seen anything this powerful that also has this homogeneous, even distribution of light. As you might expect, at a depth of 18 inches, it gets even better. With the exception of the 4 corners, which are the furthest away, almost every single measurement point is right around 200 and less than 10% or 25 points from each other. This blanket of light is as even as it gets. So to their claim of homogeneous light distribution, I think they not only achieved this, but I think they may have well just set the new standard for LED lighting and SPS reef keeping. But before we leave this topic, I want to hit one more element I don't think many reefers consider as a component of light distribution, and that's shimmer. For visual purposes, we often call these shimmer lines. However, from an intensity perspective, they're often referred to as caustic lines, caustic meaning burning, because the ripples in the water are focusing the light into more intense, high-power forms of light, which absolutely could be capable of burning corals. Many reefers have theorized that these intermittent intense beams of light stimulate the coral and are beneficial. However, in the ocean, there's only a single point of light, with the sun creating a manageable amount of these caustic lines. One sun, one wave, one caustic line. Meaning they're only exposed to them for a flicker of 1/100th of a second or so. Overall, how much total time they're exposed to these will depend on wave action and depth. In the reef aquarium with LEDs, there may be 100 or more of these LEDs creating these shimmer lines, meaning 100 LEDs, one wave, 100 caustic lines. Visually, there are so many they're hard to discern and often referred to as a disco ball effect or even static TV effect. It's easy to see how the corals could be exposed to this increased intensity as much as half the time in this environment with an overwhelming amount of shimmer or caustic lines in the tank. To get a bit better idea how this can impact a coral, we set up a par meter at a depth of 6 inches with a light 6 inches over the tank and a small pump for flow. You can see your standard cluster of LEDs had an average par of about 865 in this arrangement, but changes rapidly from as low as into the 500s to into the 1200s, which is a huge swing of 700 par, and I think absolutely relevant considering the rapid flicker and how long the corals are exposed to this in a high flow reef tank. With the Philips Coral Care, you can visually see the diffused lenses producing less of and less dramatic shimmer or caustic lines with an average of 563, but a variance of only 130 par. So not only are the high par caustic lines crossing the coral less frequently, but the variance is way less extreme as well. Again, the importance of shimmer lines, frequency, intensity, and how corals react to that is certainly up to some healthy debate, but I think one can make a pretty strong argument that the very rapid, huge intensity swings associated with non-diffused LEDs is significantly different than the older technologies we had success with or their natural ocean environment. Certainly could be a potential reason why many corals have been difficult to keep under LEDs, particularly corals which prefer low to medium light or even just lower light than their neighbors. Either way, by taming the frequency and intensity, I think they further brought home the claim of homogeneous light distribution, and I'd give them a 9 out of 10 in this regard. Certainly better than any light I've tested personally, regardless of the technology behind it. And based on the numbers here, putting up a strong challenge to T5s, which in my eyes was the king of homogeneous light distribution prior to this test. Related to that is the next claim, low energy consumption thanks to highly efficient LEDs. The specific claim they make is it will save 30% over older technologies like T5s. I don't have the ability to exact match the color point like they stated, but in week 19 of the 52 weeks of reefing where we explored fluorescent lighting, we did a test on the ATI Aqua Blue Special, which is a fuller spectrum bulb and close enough for a general idea on power consumption and related efficiency. The Philips Coral Care claims to use 190 watts, and we tested and saw 208 watts with the P3 kilowatt power bar. An 8-bulb 2-foot ATI sun power fixture consumes a claimed 192 watts and tested at exactly 192. They're very similar in size, fairly close in energy consumption and intended use or coverage, so I think this is a pretty apples to apples comparison. We're going to compare the 36-point average par at each depth. At a depth of 6 inches, the ATI Sun Power and the Aqua Blue Special bulbs had a 36-point par average of 221. At the same depth, the Philips light was 220, which is basically identical readings. At a depth of 12 inches, it was almost the same again. ATI had an average of 214 and the Philips had 207. At 18 inches deep, 206 and 199 averages. So at each level, we found the ATI to actually be higher par at very similar wattages. So at first glance, I would say the claim of increased efficiency doesn't hold a lot of weight. In fact, at 208 watts, it was lower efficiency. I will note that this is with the T5 bulbs running at a tested optimal fan speed and internal temperature, which unless you own a par meter is really unlikely. It's possible you could be running as much as 15 to 20% lower than that if you operate your T5 significantly out of their optimal temperature range. Bulbs were also brand new, there'll likely be some reduction in par output over time. So I will say the Philips 30% increase efficiency might be a real-world result over time, but in our test at optimal temps, that was not the case with the products new out of the box. I would for the most part call them equally efficient. Either way, some of you may be rather surprised by this because the presumption is LEDs are thought to be much more efficient. First off, I think the reefing community collectively may have overlooked how truly efficient T5s and optimally designed reflectors really are. Second, I think how we implement LEDs to achieve specific goals in the reef tank impacts efficiency as well. For instance, some LEDs may consume a lot of energy and add desirable spectrum, but not contribute greatly to par. The spread and distribution impacts efficiency. We can focus all the light so more of it enters the tank, but every single evolution of reef tank lighting is getting further and further away from focused light because of all the shadowing and hot spots that creates. In relation to that, I think many of you are probably wondering, what impact does the diffusion plate have on par and efficiency? The diffusion plate certainly seems like it will reduce light output and efficiency. We removed the plate and repeated the test to give you that answer. In this case, we're going to compare all 108 measurement points, which includes all 3 levels. With the diffusion plate on, we saw an average of 208 par from all 108 measurement points. Once we took the plate off, that jumped up to 257, so the diffusion plate essentially represents a 20% reduction in efficiency or par output. Now some of you might say, man, that's way too much. To that point, I would say I wouldn't use this light without it because the shimmer or caustic lines would be too dramatic. This volume of single LEDs over this wide of an area would create a completely unacceptable amount of disco or TV static effect, and all the gains in color blending would be lost as well. I guess the best analogy I can give here is if buying the cheapest car available and fuel efficiency is the only concern I had with a car purchase, I'd improve on that by getting rid of the air conditioning, heater, power brakes, windows and steering, headlights, stereo, and automatic transmission, and then I'd strip out all the heavy safety steel. But as it turns out, all those features are requirements for me to purchase and use my car, so I'd just rather buy a car with the appropriate size engine and fuel efficiency. Applied to reefing, if your only goal is energy efficiency with the tank, the diffusion plate is likely not a good option. However, I think many of us have goals and desires that go beyond that, and performance improvements are worth some efficiency trade-offs. In this case, the diffusion plate certainly seems to be adding a pretty significant amount of performance improvements for that 20% lesson in efficiency. Next claim is easy to control. I think there are some nice elements to this and some less desirable elements at the same time. Very similar to the Kessel logic, they've removed the ability to create any spectrum you want and offer a simple slider bar that balances between warm and cool colors. We took measurements at 10 different points, and again, similar to the Kessel logic, on the cool end, the blue spectrum stays the same, and all you're doing is adding in other spectrums to what pleases the eye. I think you can have success at pretty much any one of the steps in the cool end. However, once you go into the warm spectrum, you're essentially maintaining the other colors but removing the blue spectrum, which I don't find particularly valuable in a reef light, so I don't see many people using these settings. Some people will absolutely not like this because they want full control over every spectrum in an individual LED, but I have to ask if that's because they're adjusting to what the coral needs or because what that pleases their eye, which are very different things. Since less than 1 in 10,000 reefers owns a spectrometer and capable of measuring spectrum, I think it's a great benefit to reefers to intentionally limit the options to a well-balanced blue spectrum, which is healthy for the corals. Other option is to give us 10 switches to flip and just hope we get it right. I think there's going to be some healthy debate on this for sure. Overall, the software is easy to use but might be limiting to some, and the interface does seem a bit dated. To program the light, you either have to bring your light to your PC or your PC to the light, which to me at this point is completely unacceptable, even more so because they don't have a Mac or Apple version. Hauling your computer around to program your aquarium light is kind of a ridiculous standard at this point. Either a light needs to have easy to use onboard controls or a quick, easy method of programming from your phone. End of story. I'm going to call their claim of easy to control a Reef fantasy because many of us don't own a Windows-based laptop, and even if we did, this method of control is about 5 years behind the curve. Philips also claims low maintenance, which I'll agree this is with its passive cooling design, which means no fans to worry about or clean and no noise. The materials and coatings are all salt resistant and can be cleaned with a wet cloth. This is absolutely a simple, low maintenance design with no moving parts and more likely to achieve many of its lifespan claims in competitive products. The last claim of the day is easy to install and open and honest. While we've covered a lot of positive elements with this light today, I'm going to call this a complete fantasy and likely the deal killer which will prevent most of you from considering it. Sure comes with a hanging kit which clips on super easy, but this thing is 22 pounds and finding a way to safely hang that kind of weight can be far from easy for many of you. Even more so if you need to hang 2 or 3. Hanging 50 to 100 pounds from your ceiling in a safe, clean looking manner is not impossible, but in my mind amongst the most difficult to install commercially made aquarium lights out there. I'm going to take one more look at this from an easy to install attractively point of view. If you have an extremely modern home, it's possible these huge industrial fixtures might look good in your home. However, even then, there's a cord coming out of each side, meaning 4 cords for most people, and the hanging kits are large. There's no way around it. This light looks like it was designed for use in a warehouse, swimming pool, or exposition hall, and that's because they openly state that the form factor is currently used in those applications. Now, if you have a large hood or in-wall tank, this is likely not a big deal, but aesthetically, I think a vast majority of reefers will not find this acceptable for a light in the $1,000 range that's going to be in their living rooms. So overall, rating all their claims together, I'm going to give them a 7 or 8, and really nailing some of the claims in ways that I think shows a game-changing evolutionary step forward in the hobby, and then sadly missing on some of the controllability or install or form factor claims, which likely makes this current version of the light unrealistic for most people. I say current version because, as I mentioned before, this light actually isn't sold in the US yet and only available in a 220 volt version. There certainly are showing every sign of bringing it to the US soon, so we'll have to wait and see if that happens, and if this product sees a significant form factor or controllability changes, which make it more marketable. Either way, if I were a betting man, which I am, I would bet the house you're going to see a bunch of competitors come out with diffused options, which are almost certainly going to be a more reefing and living room friendly form factor, as well as onboard or phone controllability. I know personally I would consider moving to a lighting source like this, and I'm willing to consider removing my T5s for a light like this, which is something I wouldn't have considered before today. So in today's poll, we're asking you, what do you think? The Philips Coral Care LED, an evolutionary step in the right direction, or just another light in the market? Let us know what you think, and on this one, more than ever, I'm looking forward to seeing what all of you think in the comments area down below. We're currently working on our next test, but for the next couple of weeks, it's Black Friday, every day, all day. This is the sale that everyone waits for all year long. If you haven't signed up to be a preferred reefer yet, do yourself a favor and do it so you get that 5% back in addition to all the awesome deals, most of which are anywhere from 15 to 40% off.